How could the most sophisticated defensive system of the Middle Ages, one that had withstood over 20 sieges across 1,000 years, fall in a mere 53 days? The commonly accepted answer points to a single culprit: a colossal cannon, a monstrous fusion of bronze and gunpowder, unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. But what if I told you that this is merely a convenient curtain, concealing a far more intricate and captivating drama? This isn't just a tale of an invincible superweapon shattering ancient walls. No, this is an engineering thriller and a psychological detective story about how fear, ingenious obsession, and one fatal economic misstep brought down a 1,000-year empire. I invite you not merely to hear about the fall of Constantinople. I invite you to become co-conspirators in an investigation, to help us crack the code of this event and understand how a single technology irrevocably reshaped the rules of warfare. Let us, for a moment, close our eyes and transport ourselves to April of 1453. The first sensation that overwhelms us isn't the din of battle, but the hum of a colossal human beehive. Before us stretches the Ottoman encampment, a city of tents spreading as far as the eye can see. The air here is thick and heavy, a potent brew of sweat from hundreds of thousands of people and animals, the sour tang of Iran, smoke from countless bonfires roasting lamb, and the acrid, unmistakable sulfuric stench of gunpowder workshops. This is the industrial scent of a new kind of warfare. Instead of the noble clang of swords, there's a methodical, industrial rumble. Thousands of hammers striking anvils, winches groaning, and above it all, the guttural chatter in dozens of dialects: Turkish, Arabic, Serbian, Greek. Now, let's cross the walls and enter the besieged Constantinople. Here, the air and sounds are starkly different. The scent of fear mingles with the aroma of frankincense, smoldering day and night in dozens of churches. A salty sea breeze from the Bosphorus carries the scent of fish and rotting seaweed. Instead of industrial clamor, there's the desperate peal of church bells, summoning prayers that feel like a final plea. The scraping of stone can be heard as citizens, under the cloak of night, desperately try to patch the breaches in the walls. In this city, there's no conquering energy, only a cold, 1,000-year weariness and the stubborn resolve of the dying. It's a clash of two worlds, palpable in their very scents and sounds. To truly grasp the abyss separating these two worlds, we must crack their cultural codes. For the city's defenders, the word Byzantium didn't exist. It was a fabrication of later historians. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans, and their capital, New Rome. Deeply ingrained in their consciousness was the idea of inviolability. For 1,000 years, these walls, consecrated to the Theotokos herself, had repelled every foe. They were more than mere stone. They were a symbol of divine order, the last bastion of true faith and civilization in a world of barbarians. To lose the city wasn't just to lose a war. It was the end of the world in miniature, the apocalypse of their personal universe. The attackers harbored their own, equally potent, deeply ingrained belief system. The 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II was obsessed with an idea his people called Kızıl Elma, the red apple. For centuries, the Turks had used this name for Constantinople, envisioning it as a mythical fruit to be plucked by the greatest of rulers. For Mehmed, this was more than a mere conquest. It was the fulfillment of an Islamic prophecy, the very purpose of his life. He was more than a mere general. He was a warrior of faith, a Ghazi, destined to raise the crescent moon atop the dome of Hagia Sophia. This messianic conviction imbued him and his army with superhuman energy and a willingness to make any sacrifice. Mehmed II's project was far more than a simple military campaign. It was the 15th century's most audacious and high-stakes research and development project, with the Sultan himself serving as its obsessed chief executive officer. He refused to rely on old methods. Instead, He gambled on a breakthrough, almost fantastical technology in which few truly believed. Much like a modern tech visionary who pours all a company's resources into creating a single revolutionary product, Mehmed staked his entire empire on one objective: to forge a weapon that would render the thousand-year concept of impregnable walls utterly obsolete. And so, on a narrow strip of land by the Bosphorus, not just two armies clashed, but two realities collided. On one side stood a world that believed in divine providence, the unshakable nature of tradition, and the sacred geometry of its walls. On the other, a world that believed in prophecy, buttressed by the most precise mathematics, the most advanced metallurgy, and the most destructive chemistry of its era. This wasn't a battle for territory, it was a battle for the very direction of the future. The genesis of this entire drama lay in one seemingly mundane problem: money. In late 1452, as the Ottoman noose tightened around Constantinople, a man whose name would become synonymous with the end of an era walked into the throne room of the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos. This was a Hungarian cannon engineer and master founder named Urban. He was neither a patriot nor a villain. He was a mercenary genius, a man of a new mold, interested in two things: the complexity of the technical challenge and the size of the reward. He came to the emperor with a bold proposition. He could cast cannons for the Christians powerful enough to sweep away any army that dared approach the walls. Emperor Constantine, ruler of a dying empire, fully understood the value of this offer. He knew his handful of defenders couldn't withstand the Ottoman horde without some technological miracle. But the miracle never materialized. The treasury was empty. For centuries, Byzantium had bled gold and territories. All the emperor could offer the brilliant engineer was a modest salary that wouldn't cover even a tenth of the costs. Urban listened, turned, and left. In that moment, in the silence of the imperial palace, an invisible tectonic shift occurred. The Byzantines, unknowingly, had just handed the keys to their city to their greatest enemy. Urban crossed the Bosphorus and headed straight to the Ottoman encampment in Edirne, where he was received by Sultan Mehmed II. It was a meeting of two obsessed men. One was consumed by the idea of conquering the great city, the other by the idea of creating the greatest instrument of destruction. Urban laid out his plan, but now his ambitions had grown exponentially. He proposed creating not just a large cannon. He offered to create a bronze leviathan, a siege god, a weapon that wouldn't merely breach walls, but would obliterate them. A device capable of hurling stone cannonballs, weighing over 1,000 pounds a distance of nearly a mile. It sounded like madness. No one had ever created anything like it. The largest bombard cannons of the time seemed like children's toys compared to this monster. Any other ruler would have dismissed it as bragging or charlatanism, but not Mehmed. In Urban's proposal, he saw not technical risk, but a divine omen, a tool for fulfilling his destiny. The Sultan didn't bargain. He asked only one question: can you cast a weapon capable of shattering the walls of Babylon? Upon receiving an affirmative answer, he granted the engineer unlimited resources, hundreds of laborers, tons of copper and tin, casting pits the size of houses, and a complete blank check. After 3 months of titanic labor, the monstrosity was ready. The cannon, later to be called Basilica, measured approximately 26 feet long and boasted a barrel nearly 8 inches thick. For its first test, the entire population of Edirne was gathered. When the fuse was lit, the earth shuddered. The deafening roar, like a peal of thunder, was heard for tens of miles. A 600-kilogram stone cannonball flew nearly 2 kilometers and, crashing to the ground, buried itself almost 2 meters deep into the soil. The effect was astonishing. This wasn't just a display of force. This was the announcement of a new world. News of this test reverberated across the entire Mediterranean, creating a bombshell effect. No one in the Christian world could believe such a weapon was real. For the defenders of Constantinople, who had previously relied on the impregnability of their 1,000-year-old walls, this news was the first and perhaps most devastating blow. Even before the Basilica fired its first shot at the city, its reputation had already begun to dismantle Constantinople's primary defense, the belief in its own invulnerability. The psychological war had been won by Mehmed even before the siege began. Urban's giant cannon wasn't just a weapon. To grasp its essence, we must discard conventional images. Imagine not a cannon, but a mobile industrial complex dedicated to producing destruction. The Basilica was merely the heart of this monster, its fire-breathing core, around which revolved an entire ecosystem of hundreds of people, dozens of animals, and complex logistical chains. This wasn't a hero's sword. It was a nomadic volcano that first had to be built, then painstakingly transported to its target, and finally forced to erupt on schedule. It is in this mechanics, not magic, that the secret to its success lies. Let's look under the hood. The creation of the cannon itself was an engineering feat bordering on the impossible. Urban chose bronze over cast iron because it was more ductile and predictable for casting on such a massive scale, though far more expensive. In colossal pits dug into the earth, he created a mold into which dozens of tons of molten metal were then poured. The slightest error, an air bubble, a crack in the mold, incorrect temperature, and the entire effort would have been for naught. This was a game played with fire, literally and figuratively, and Urban won the first round. But casting the monster was only half the battle. The real marvel began afterward. How do you transport a behemoth weighing about 60 tons from Edirne to the walls of Constantinople, a distance of over 125 miles? This operation in itself was more complex than many military campaigns. A special convoy was assembled to move the cannon. Leading the way was a contingent of hundreds of laborers who literally built the road, leveling the ground, felling trees, constructing temporary bridges. Behind them, 60 oxen, the strongest in the entire empire, slowly, at a pace of no more than 2.5 miles per day, pulled the giant carriage bearing the weapon. Flanking them were another 200 people who supported the carriage, wedging blocks and levers under the wheels on uneven terrain to prevent it from toppling. This entire procession stretched for miles and crept toward its destination for nearly 2 months. Now, imagine the firing process itself, as documented by eyewitnesses. It was a slow, almost sacred ritual. Step 1. Positioning. The cannon was mounted on a massive wooden carriage, dug into the ground and reinforced with stones to prevent it from being overturned by recoil. Step 2. Cleaning. After each shot, several hours were spent cooling the barrel with water and cleaning it of fouling using giant sponges soaked in sheep's wool. Step 3. Powder charging. This was the most dangerous part. The artillerymen, risking their lives, carefully loaded hundreds of kilograms of black powder into the barrel, meticulously measuring each portion. Step 4. Loading the shot. A 600-kilogram stone cannonball was rolled to the muzzle using winches and a system of ramps. Then it was slowly and carefully pushed deep into the barrel with wooden levers. Step 5. Aiming. This was extremely primitive and accomplished by placing wedges under the carriage. But Mehmed didn't need pinpoint accuracy. He needed to strike roughly the same spot. And finally, step 6, the shot. The crew scattered, one brave soul lit the fuse, and then also scrambled for cover. The earth trembled. The roar tore eardrums. A pillar of fire and smoke erupted from the muzzle, and the giant black sphere hurtled with a shriek toward the ancient walls. But here's the most astonishing part. This engineering god was incredibly temperamental and imperfect. The diary of the Venetian Niccolo Barbaro is, essentially, a log of its technical malfunctions. Due to monstrous overheating, the Basilica could fire no more than 7 times a day. Reloading took anywhere from 3 to 4 hours. The consumption of gunpowder was colossal, and crucially, the cannon itself was pushed to its absolute structural limits. Within a few weeks of the siege, cracks appeared on its barrel, and on one occasion it actually exploded, reportedly killing its creator, Urban. The superweapon, it turned out, was fragile, slow, and dangerous even to its own masters. Where, then, lay the true genius of Mehmed? He grasped a truth that eluded the defenders. The power of this weapon wasn't in breaching a wall with a single decisive blow. Its true purpose was far more subtle. The Basilica cannon and its younger siblings functioned like an industrial-grade jackhammer. 7 times a day, with relentless precision, they hammered the same spot, a section of wall near the gate of St. Romanus. They gave the defenders no respite for proper repairs, turning their nights into an infernal struggle to patch ever-widening breaches. This was a war of attrition, pitting ancient stones against the relentless, methodical rhythm of industrial-scale destruction. We marvel at the technology of these cannons, but let's take a moment to imagine the human spirit that stood against them. For a simple Genoese mercenary or a Byzantine militiaman on the wall, the world, over those 53 days, shrank to a mere few dozen feet of pulverized stone. His reality wasn't about strategy or geopolitics. It was a constant, mind-numbing thunder that made the earth vibrate and ears bleed. It was dust clogging his lungs, and the eternal dread that the next cannonball would strike precisely where he stood. And when night fell and the cannons finally silenced, his true hell began. Instead of rest, there was Herculean labor. Under the engineer's guidance, he joined the city dwellers in hauling stones, logs, and sacks of earth to patch gaping holes, knowing full well that at dawn, the soulless mechanism would resume its methodical work of undoing his efforts. Behind this desperate resistance stood 2 individuals, without whom the walls would have fallen not in 53 days, but in a mere week. The first wasn't a Byzantine at all, but a mercenary, a professional soldier from Genoa, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. He was the Steve Jobs of 15th century defense, a man who thought outside the box and found an asymmetrical answer to the threat. He was the first to grasp that against the might of gunpowder, solid stone was utterly useless. A cannonball simply pulverized it. And so he implemented a stroke of genius. Instead of constructing new stone barricades, he ordered the creation of earthen ramparts behind the breaches made from whatever was at hand. Barrels filled with dirt, logs, bales of wool, and even grapevines. These improvised fortifications functioned like modern composite armor. They were soft and pliant. The heavy stone cannonballs didn't shatter them. Instead, they became embedded, their monstrous kinetic energy absorbed. Every night, under his leadership, teams of defenders, like tireless ants, repaired the devastated sections. Giustiniani transformed the defense into a flexible, adaptive system. He was the strategic mind that countered the brute force of Ottoman artillery with engineering ingenuity and unparalleled logistical organization. He nearly achieved the impossible. He found a way to defeat a superweapon. Yet, Giustiniani's genius wouldn't have been enough without a second, less celebrated hero, the Grand Duke Loukas Notaras. If Giustiniani was the chief engineer on the front lines, Notaras was his executive director in the rear. As the head of the Byzantine government, he faced an equally daunting challenge: where to acquire resources in a dying, impoverished city. It was he who organized the civilian population, transforming merchants, artisans, and even monks into nighttime builders. He emptied church coffers in search of silver to pay mercenaries and requisitioned the last of the grain to feed the army. Without Notaras's administrative prowess, which squeezed the very last drops from the city's resources, Giustiniani would have simply lacked the manpower and materials for his brilliant strategies. These two, the Genoese condottiere and the Byzantine aristocrat, formed an incredibly effective tandem that almost nullified Mehmed's entire technological advantage. They were the human factor that no machine could possibly calculate. And here's a startling everyday detail that encapsulates the very essence of this standoff. In the final weeks of the siege, the most effective defensive structures weren't the ancient walls, but ordinary barrels. Thousands of wooden barrels, once holding wine and olive oil. On Giustiniani's orders, they were filled with earth and rubble, then stacked like giant building blocks to form breastworks in place of breaches. This simple, almost homespun technology proved astonishingly effective. It grounded history, revealing how, at the decisive moment, the fate of a 1,000-year-old empire hinged not on marble and gold, but on ingenuity, desperation, and common wine barrels. By the end of May of 1453, the siege had reached a tactical stalemate. Giovanni Giustiniani's ingenious defensive system was working. Nightly repairs, earthen ramparts, and barrels of soil had negated all the advantages of Ottoman artillery. Cannons continued to fire, walls continued to crumble, but the defenders, like a phoenix, rebuilt their defenses from ash and stone every single night. The Ottoman army was exhausted. Murmurs of discontent grew louder. Even in Mehmed's own tent, his viziers advised lifting the siege before it was too late. Just a little longer, and the Sultan might have retreated. The defenders' plan seemed on the verge of success, and it was precisely at this moment that the perfect storm struck. On May 29th, Mehmed, risking everything, threw his troops into one final desperate, all-out assault. Wave after wave of Janissaries crashed against the walls, but the defenders, inspired by the personal example of Emperor Constantine and Giustiniani, fought to the death. And then, in the very thick of the battle, when it seemed even this assault would be repelled, the unforeseen happened. Not a giant cannonball, but a tiny shard, or an arquebus bullet, found a chink in Giovanni Giustiniani's armor. The wound was severe. Bleeding profusely, he ordered himself carried from the wall to his tent on a Genoese ship. In that moment, the very cohesiveness that had been the army's greatest strength turned into its greatest weakness. Giustiniani was more than just a commander. He was the brain, the heart, and the steel framework of the entire defense. His departure, even if temporary, witnessed by hundreds of soldiers, had a domino effect. Panic and uncertainty, like a poison, began to spread through the defenders' ranks. A system held together by the genius and will of one man instantly lost its central command. And as if by some diabolical script, at these very minutes, on another, completely calm section of the wall, a second catastrophe unfolded. A small group of Janissaries discovered a tiny postern gate in the wall, known as the Porta, unlocked. Perhaps it had been forgotten after one of the night sorties. Through this chink in the 1,000-year-old city's armor, the Ottomans began to filter inside, getting behind the main defensive forces. One of them climbed a tower and hoisted an Ottoman banner. The cry of "the city is taken," that echoed along the walls, became the final blow. The defenders, already demoralized by the loss of their leader, saw the enemy flag in their rear. Organized resistance crumbled, devolving into chaotic flight. The system that had almost defeated the world's most powerful army disintegrated into dust in a matter of minutes due to one stray bullet and one unlocked door. The walls didn't fall to cannon fire. They were bypassed. The defense wasn't breached. It was decapitated and psychologically broken. And here, the most crucial and uncomfortable question hangs in the air. If the fate of the battle was decided not by tons of bronze and gunpowder, but by human factors and a fatal accident, then was Mehmed's giant cannon truly the key to victory? Or was it merely the most expensive and deafening diversionary operation in the history of warfare? So, was the Basilica simply a colossal diversion? Historians still fiercely debate this, and there's no easy answer. The first theory, embraced by many military analysts, posits that the cannon was absolutely key to victory, but not in the way we usually imagine. Its purpose wasn't to blast a breach for the final assault, but to create a constant, festering wound. It pinned the defenders' elite forces, their primary genius, Giustiniani, and all their meager repair resources to one single section of the wall. It functioned like a giant magnet, drawing all the city's attention and strength, thereby making the entire rest of the defensive line vulnerable to such random occurrences as an unlocked postern gate. But there's a second, more fatalistic theory. According to it, neither cannons nor the heroism of the defenders could have changed anything. The fall of Constantinople was as inevitable as the changing of seasons. By 1453, Byzantium was no longer an empire, but a ghost city with a grand name. Its population had dwindled to 50,000 people. It was surrounded on all sides, cut off from the world, and completely bankrupt. In this paradigm, the siege was not a battle between equals, but the final, almost ritualistic act of finishing off a fallen giant. Urban's cannons merely provided the deafening soundtrack to a funeral that was destined to happen regardless. Let's talk about economics, because that's where the true scale of what transpired is revealed. Mehmed II's artillery project was, without exaggeration, the Manhattan Project of the 15th century. The cost of casting dozens of cannons, procuring thousands of tons of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, plus all the logistics for their delivery and maintenance, was astronomical. This was the most expensive military campaign of its time, a wager that could have bankrupted any other power. But the Ottoman Empire was at the peak of its might. It controlled the richest trade routes and resources of Anatolia and the Balkans. Mehmed could afford it. Compare that to Byzantium's financial state. Emperor Constantine couldn't even pay a single engineer. To scrape together money for the defense, he was forced to conduct confiscations and beg the church for its last precious silverware. By the most conservative estimates, the budget for this single Ottoman campaign likely exceeded the entire annual income of the Byzantine Empire tenfold. This wasn't merely a war of technologies, but a war of economies. The outcome was predetermined even before the first shot, in the ledgers of the Ottoman treasury and the empty coffers of the Constantinian palace. And here we arrive at the hidden meanings. For Mehmed, the conquest was not only a military act, but also a symbolic one. When he entered the city, he didn't give it over to complete plunder. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia and ordered it converted into a mosque, preserving the building itself. And then he assumed a title that blew the minds of the entire European world, Kaiser-i Rom, meaning Caesar of Rome. This wasn't merely a gesture of vanity, it was a political manifesto. He didn't destroy the Second Rome, he declared himself its legitimate heir. Thus, the giant cannons and colossal expenditures were not simply tools for demolishing walls. This was the most expensive public relations campaign in history. By investing untold sums in this superweapon, Mehmed wasn't just buying victory, he was buying legitimacy. He was demonstrating to the entire world that the old era had ended, and on its ruins, a new superpower was being born, possessing not only military might, but also the right to claim the 1,000-year legacy of Rome. And now, having observed all the pieces of this incredible mosaic, Urban's bronze behemoth, Giustiniani's tactical genius, the emperor's depleted treasury, the fatal wound, and that fateful unlocked postern gate, the picture comes into chillingly sharp focus. We've gathered all the evidence, and it's time to deliver a verdict in this historical investigation. For a long time, the common wisdom held that the answer was simple. A massive cannon conquered massive walls. But that's like saying an iceberg sank the Titanic. Yes, technically true, but it's only the final act of the drama, not its core essence. What then is the true secret behind the fall of Constantinople? It lies not in the superiority of a single technology, but in a total systemic collapse. For 1,000 years, Byzantium had operated under a single paradigm. Its walls were the ultimate weapon of deterrence. They were so formidable that the very notion of assaulting them was considered madness. The city's entire military, economic, and even psychological framework was built around this axiom. And Mehmed II's genius lay not in building a cannon to pierce the wall. His genius was in understanding that to truly win, One didn't need to breach the wall, but to dismantle the entire system for which that wall was the center of the universe. The Basilica and its sisters were not merely weapons, they were tools of systemic disruption. They attacked not the stone, but the most vulnerable points of the Byzantine system. First, they attacked the economy. Every cannonball cost immense sums, but every night's repair effort drained the defenders of their last, irreplaceable resources. It was a war of attrition, in which an impoverished city stood no chance against the wealthiest empire. Second, they attacked time itself. The cannons robbed the defenders of sleep, transforming the siege into a relentless 53-day marathon of survival. They stripped people of their most crucial resource, their strength. And third, and most crucially, they attacked faith itself. Every earth-shattering blow was a direct assault on the 1,000-year-old myth of their own invincibility. This was psychological warfare for a new era. The roar of the cannons was the voice of a new age, declaring to the city's inhabitants, "Your gods have abandoned you. Your walls are no longer sacred. Your past offers no guarantee of your future." Mehmed wasn't merely breaking stone. Day after day, he was methodically eroding the defender's most vital, intangible asset, hope. And when the system was pushed to its absolute limits, economically, physically, and psychologically, it became as fragile as glass. In such a state, any random incident, any tiny crack, turns fatal. Giustiniani's injury and an unlatched gate were not the causes of the fall. They were symptoms of the collapse. When a body is exhausted, a common cold can be deadly. When a defense system is pushed to its breaking point, a single misstep can shatter it entirely. So, what exactly was the fall of Constantinople? It wasn't merely a battle. It was history's first successful techno-psychological special operation. It was the triumph of a systemic approach over traditional methods. Mehmed II was no mere conqueror. He was a systems architect of destruction, meticulously identifying and ruthlessly exploiting every vulnerability of the old world. He pitted the cold mathematics of ballistics against the sacred geometry of the walls. Against a belief in miracles, he deployed industrial might and boundless resources. This transcends mere politics or warfare. It's a vivid demonstration of a fundamental law of history. Any system, no matter how perfect, if it becomes insular and unable to adapt to new challenges, is doomed. Mehmed's cannons were merely the catalyst that accelerated this inevitable chemical process. And in this realization lies the true magnitude of the event. The thunderous roar of the Basilica cannon at the gate of St. Romanus was more than just the sound of a gunshot. It was the shattering crack of an entire era's backbone. The world of medieval castles, chivalric valor, and impregnable fortresses was dying in real time, and humanity, holding its breath, listened to this deafening requiem. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of one empire. It was the very rock that, tumbling from a mountain, triggered an avalanche that reshaped the entire geography of the world. The first domino to fall with a deafening crash was global trade. For centuries, goods from Asia, silk, spices, porcelain flowed into Europe through Constantinople. The Ottomans didn't completely block this route, but they seized strict control, sending tariffs skyrocketing. They literally slammed a lock on Europe's eastern gate, severing the main aorta of the global economy. For Venice and Genoa, who had held the reins of this entire trade, it was a catastrophe. For all of Europe, it signaled the dawn of an era of pervasive scarcity and the desperate, even mad, search for alternatives. It was precisely this economic shock that triggered a chain reaction still reverberating today. What do you do if the door is locked? You look for a window. Stripped of their customary route, European monarchs and merchants poured all their resources into finding a new sea passage to India, one that bypassed the Ottoman world. And so, merely 39 years after the fall of Constantinople, a Genoese man named Christopher Columbus obsessed with the idea of reaching Asia by sailing west, convinced the Spanish crown to fund his expedition. Just a few years later, the Portuguese Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and reached the shores of India. The thunderous boom of Mehmed's cannons at the walls of the Second Rome became the starting gun for the age of discovery. The ambition to circumvent one empire led to the uncovering of two new continents and the birth of the globalized world we inhabit today. Yet the legacy wasn't solely geographical. In the years leading up to and during the siege, a grand exodus began from the doomed city. Thousands of Byzantine scholars, artists and philosophers, safeguarding their lives and their most precious treasure, knowledge, fled to Italy. With them, they carried an invaluable cargo: ancient manuscripts by Plato, Aristotle, and Ptolemy, texts that in Europe had either been forgotten entirely or were known only through distorted summaries. This intellectual injection of antiquity, poured into the simmering crucible of Italian city-states, had the impact of an exploding bomb. It became one of the most powerful catalysts for the Renaissance. Thus, the demise of the Byzantine world breathed life into a new European culture, one founded on the rediscovery of its own ancient past. Even today, often without realizing it, we live in the shadow of this event. When you gaze upon the iconic skyline of Istanbul with its majestic mosques, you are witnessing a direct legacy of 1453. Hagia Sophia, with its colossal dome, so captivated the imagination of Mehmed and his successors that it became the architectural prototype for all great Ottoman mosques, including the renowned Blue Mosque. The great architect Sinan and his followers spent their entire lives attempting to surpass the creation of the Byzantine master builders. Thus, a captured Christian sanctuary gave birth to a unique Ottoman architectural style that shaped the face of one of the world's greatest cities for the next 500 years. But here lies the central paradox of this legacy. Mehmed's original vision, as we recall, was not one of destruction, but of continuity. He aspired to be the new Roman Caesar. However, in the European consciousness, this event became eternally etched in a vastly different image. The fall of Constantinople became a symbol not of synthesis, but of irreconcilable civilizational conflict, the eternal struggle between the cross and the crescent. This tragic and simplistic interpretation shaped relations between the Christian and Islamic worlds for centuries to come, transforming a complex historical event into a potent political myth that is leveraged even to this very day. And a second, no less ironic paradox. Urban's cannon was forged to prove a point. The age of impregnable walls was over, and for a time this held true. Yet the response wasn't the disappearance of fortresses, but their revolutionary transformation. Military engineers, primarily in Italy, realized that what was needed against cannons were not towering walls, but low, thick, and angular bastions capable of deflecting cannonballs. Thus was born the system of star forts, known as Tres à l'Italienne, which for the next 300 years became the cutting edge in fortification. The very weapon designed to destroy walls ultimately led to the creation of even more sophisticated and ingenious walls. The domino effect worked both ways, igniting an endless arms race between projectile and armor that continues even to this day. It might seem that the tale of bronze cannons and stone walls is a dusty relic of bygone days, covered in the sands of time. But if you listen closely, in the thunder of the Basilica, you can discern the deafening echo of our own fears and challenges. The 15th century and the 21st century bear a disquieting resemblance. Like the Byzantines, we live in an era of tectonic shifts, where one groundbreaking technology after another, be it artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, or cyber warfare, aims directly at the very foundations of our own seemingly impregnable walls, our economy, our political systems, and even our understanding of what it means to be human. The Byzantines' problem wasn't that they were foolish or weak. Their tragedy lay in being experts of yesterday. For 1,000 years, their system had functioned flawlessly, and they had unlearned how to imagine a world where it might fail. They saw the new cannon, but mentally categorized it as simply a very large trebuchet, attempting to combat it with old, proven methods, patching walls and appealing to God. They failed to grasp that Mehmed was playing an entirely different game, one where the targets were not stone, but time, resources, and psychology. And the most crucial lesson Constantinople imparts to the 21st century is this: the greatest danger of any disruptive innovation lies not within the innovation itself, but in our inability to grasp in time the fundamental rules of the game it has irrevocably altered. We continue to desperately patch our old walls when we should be constructing an entirely new defense system, or perhaps even abandoning the concept of walls altogether. Attempting to regulate artificial intelligence with laws written for the age of the printing press is akin to mending a breach from a 600-kilogram cannonball with sacks of wool. It might offer a temporary reprieve, but it utterly fails to address the systemic problem. The story of Constantinople's fall is an anthem to asymmetric thinking. Mehmed triumphed not because his cannon was perfect, it was terribly flawed. He won because he found one singular pressure point that, when pressed, collapsed the entire enemy system. He understood there was no need to destroy the entire wall. It was enough to create a constant, festering wound that would drain his opponent of all vitality. Today, new Mehmeds operate in precisely the same way, striking not at armies, but at our information networks, financial systems, and public trust. This history stands as a potent warning against the illusion of permanence. The Byzantines genuinely believed their city, their faith, and their world represented the final, pinnacle achievement of human development. The very thought that it all could vanish seemed sacrilegious to them. They fell victim to their own grand narrative. Their greatest achievement, those impregnable walls, fostered a fatal overconfidence that blinded them to a new reality. And perhaps the most important preliminary conclusion we can draw, gazing upon these ancient scarred stones, is a reminder. The highest and thickest walls we build are not around our cities, but within our own minds. These are the walls of dogma, tradition, and the comfortable certainty that tomorrow will be just like yesterday. And history, with ruthless clarity, demonstrates no wall collapses as quickly and as terrifyingly under the blows of a new world as the one we refuse to see. Now, let us perform the most challenging intellectual trick. Let's cross over to the other side of the hill and view Constantinople through the eyes of Mehmed II. In the European tradition, he is depicted as a cruel conqueror, the scourge of God, but this is a caricature crafted by the losers. In reality, the 21-year-old Sultan was no savage barbarian, but a man of a new mold, a true Renaissance prince, only from Edirne rather than Florence. He spoke 6 languages, including Latin and Greek, devoured the works of ancient historians, and studied mathematics and ballistics. He saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a successor to Alexander the Great and the Roman Caesars. In his eyes, the Ottoman Empire was a young, vibrant, passionate force that had come to replace a decrepit, degenerate world. And how wild and incomprehensible the Byzantines themselves must have seemed to him. Imagine his shock. He saw before him not a great empire, but a ghost city inhabited by the living dead, clinging to grand titles while possessing neither gold nor soldiers. Their behavior was the epitome of irrationality. At the very moment the greatest army in the world stood at their walls, what was Constantinople's elite doing? Engaging in bitter theological disputes about whether to accept union with Catholic Rome in exchange for military aid. It went so far that the head of the Byzantine fleet, Loukas Notaras, uttered a phrase that to any pragmatist sounds like pure madness. Better to see the Turkish turban reigning in the city than the Latin tiara. They hated their Christian brethren more than the enemy at their gates. For Mehmed, whose well-drilled army operated as a single disciplined mechanism, this internal squabbling was a clear sign of civilizational decay. To the Ottomans, the Byzantines were not cunning enemies, but rather arrogant and ungrateful neighbors. They occupied a city that was geographically the heart of Ottoman territories, bisecting their European and Asian holdings. They constantly engaged in intrigues, attempting to pit the Hungarians against the Sultan, then the Venetians, and harbored Ottoman pretenders to the throne as a trump card. From Mehmed's perspective, he was not committing an act of unprovoked aggression. He was performing a necessary surgical operation to remove a cancerous tumor from the body of his young, burgeoning empire. He was restoring order, and herein lies the tragedy of predictability. The Byzantines, heirs to a 1,000-year diplomatic and military tradition, proved utterly unprepared for this new type of thinking. Their greatest strength, their unwavering faith in the immutability of their world, became their greatest weakness. They were accustomed to walls solving everything. They were used to being able to sow discord among their enemies or buy them off. They were accustomed to a miracle appearing at the very last moment, or aid arriving from Europe. Their entire strategy was passive and reactive. Mehmed, however, brought with him an entirely new logic, the mindset of an engineer and a project manager. He didn't bank on a miracle. He meticulously calculated the budget, recruited top-tier specialists, orchestrated a precise production chain, and set a crystal-clear technical objective for his team. While the Byzantines prayed for a divine miracle, Mehmed forged his own from bronze, saltpeter, and meticulous mathematical calculations. The old world, steeped in its rituals, intrigues, and faith in divine providence, collided with a new world that placed its trust in technology, meticulous organization, and an unyielding will. The outcome of this clash was sealed not by the strength of the walls, but by the clash of mental models. Genius always comes at a price, and Mehmed II paid it in full. His most agonizing and morally ambiguous decision was made not at the siege's outset, but at its bitter end, on the eve of the final assault. His army was at its breaking point. The soldiers were exhausted, casualties mounted, and their morale had plummeted. To ignite one last furious burst of energy within them, Mehmed did what many commanders before him had done. He struck a Faustian bargain with the devil of war. He promised his army 3 days of total, unrestricted plunder of the city should victory be theirs. This was far more than a mere military tactic. It was the moment when the enlightened connoisseur of ancient history gave way to a ruthless pragmatist, one who would readily torch the world's greatest library simply to claim its building. The repercussions of this decision were monstrous and irreversible. When the city fell, Ottoman soldiers, intoxicated by bloodlust and greed, surged through its streets. What followed was a bacchanal of destruction. Tens of thousands of citizens were slaughtered or enslaved. But even more devastating was the cultural catastrophe. Priceless icons and mosaics were obliterated, ancient statues shattered, and thousands of manuscripts, the works of Greek philosophers, scholars, and poets, carefully preserved in monasteries and private collections, were burned or simply discarded. Mehmed, who had dreamed of becoming a new Caesar and inheriting the glory of Rome, claimed his city, but it was no longer a living organism. It was a gutted husk. He had conquered Constantinople, yet with his own hands he sanctioned the obliteration of a vast portion of the very heritage he so passionately coveted. This compromise, however, was merely the outward manifestation of a profound internal transformation. The crushing weight of responsibility and the relentless tension of the 53-day siege irrevocably reshaped the young Sultan's character. Imagine his predicament. A 21-year-old monarch who had staked not only his army, but also his own life and dynasty on this audacious gamble. Every single day, he contended not only with the Byzantines' stubborn resistance, but also with covert sabotage within his own camp. His viziers, representatives of the old aristocracy, whispered behind his back that he was a madman, steering the empire toward ruin. This utter solitude at the pinnacle of power, this daily battle not only against the enemy but also against his own people, transformed him from a dreamy idealist poring over Plutarch into a harsh, suspicious, and utterly ruthless monarch. He had learned power's most brutal lesson. To forge a new world, one must first burn to ashes all who cling to the old. And the most significant sacrifice on this altar of ambition was not an enemy, but one of the most influential figures in his own empire, Grand Vizier Sandallah Halil Pasha. Halil Pasha, a man of the old guard, was a sagacious and circumspect politician who had served even Mehmed's father. From the very beginning, he had been the primary opponent of the Constantinople venture, deeming it far too perilous. Throughout the entire siege, he had been the voice of dissent, urging the Sultan to retreat. For Mehmed, he was more than just an adversary. He was the living embodiment of everything that impeded Mehmed's drive: tradition, caution, and a palpable disbelief in his nascent genius. The instant the last defender fell and Mehmed rode into the conquered city, his first act as a ruler was neither a feast nor a prayer. He ordered the arrest of Sandallah Halil Pasha. Days later, after a swift trial on trumped-up charges of accepting bribes from the Byzantines, the once mighty vizier was executed. This was far more than mere vengeance. It was a chilling political declaration. By executing the most influential man in the state, a man who had dared to question his grand vision, Mehmed sent an unmistakable signal to the entire Ottoman elite. The era of advice and debate was over. The age of absolute unrestrained sultanic power had begun. Thus, Sandallah Halil Pasha, the loyal servant of the old system, was sacrificed at the altar of the new. His tragedy vividly illustrates the real, darker cost of brilliant ambition. Mehmed's victory demanded not only technological breakthroughs and military valor, it demanded the elimination of all who stood in the way, including those closest to him. The grand dream of the Red Apple was paid for, not just with bronze and gunpowder, but with the blood of comrades who had become obstacles. When the cannons fell silent and the dust settled, the most intricate and fascinating act of this drama began: the clash of two civilizations within the same city walls. The notion of a melting pot where cultures peacefully blend is a beautiful but utterly false myth. Initially, it was not a synthesis, but a harsh, irreconcilable conflict that unfolded in the streets, in the temples, and in the hearts and minds of the people. The conqueror's first move was to crack the city's sacred code. Hagia Sophia, the heart of the Orthodox world for 1,000 years, was not destroyed. It was appropriated. Wooden minarets were erected along its sides like bayonets fixed to a rifle. The unique golden mosaics depicting Christ and the saints, masterpieces of global art, were whitewashed over or covered with shields bearing verses from the Quran. This was a collision of sounds and symbols. The millennium-old chime of church bells, which had been the city's very pulse, fell silent forever. In its place, 5 times a day, the muezzin's call to prayer began to echo from the newly constructed minarets. Greek, the language of Homer and Plato, the language of the imperial chancellery, instantly became a minority tongue. Now, the language of power was Ottoman Turkish, and the language of religion and scholarship, Arabic. This was not a dialogue of cultures, but the deafening monologue of the victor. The old culture wasn't erased, but it was demonstratively downgraded, confined to ethnic quarters and private homes. The Ottoman system, known as the millet, legally cemented this new order. Roman Greeks, Armenians, Jews, all were granted the right to live under their own laws and practice their faith, led by their religious leaders. But for this autonomy, they paid a special tax and endured the status of dhimmis, second-class citizens who could never be equal to a Muslim in the eyes of the authorities. So, initially, Constantinople, which became Istanbul, was not a melting pot, but rather an archipelago of isolated cultural islands, coexisting in the same urban space without truly blending. Yet history, much like nature, abhors a vacuum and pure forms. Even the most rigid conflict eventually gives rise to the most astonishing hybrids. The conqueror, often unwittingly, inevitably becomes infected by the culture of the conquered. The Ottomans, a nomadic people from the Anatolian plains, were utterly awestruck and captivated by the monumental grandeur of Byzantine architecture. They didn't just seize Hagia Sophia, they fell deeply in love with it. Its colossal dome, seemingly floating in the air, became an obsession for them, an architectural ideal they strove to surpass for centuries to come. It was precisely from this creative challenge that the era's most astonishing hybrid, the classical Ottoman imperial style, was born. The great architect Mimar Sinan and his successors took the fundamental Byzantine structural framework, the central dome on pendentives, and injected it with a new Islamic DNA. They surrounded it with cascading half-domes, added elegant pointed minarets, and adorned the interiors not with figurative mosaics, but with intricate calligraphy and geometric patterns. The majestic Blue Mosque, standing directly opposite Hagia Sophia, is not a rejection of Byzantine heritage, but its most ingenious reinterpretation. It's an architectural dialogue across centuries, born from both conflict and admiration. This process also unfolded at an everyday level. The imperial kitchens of Topkapi Palace became a gigantic laboratory of synthesis. Here, Turkish traditions, with their fondness for yogurt, lamb, and phyllo dough, met Byzantine influences, bringing olive oil, seafood, and vegetables. Persian Arab elements contributed sophisticated spices, rice, and sweets based on nuts and honey. The result of this fusion was one of the world's greatest cuisines, which we now know as Turkish. Even the famous baklava is a perfect culinary hybrid born at the crossroads of civilizations. So, how did life change for the average person? For a Greek merchant, it meant learning Turkish to conduct business, paying new taxes, and accepting that his city was now under a different power. For a Turkish soldier who received a home in the city, it meant discovering a new world, a world of stone houses, maritime trade, exotic fruits, and even stranger customs of his Christian neighbors. Istanbul didn't become a monolithic city, but it transformed into the most complex and multifaceted metropolis of its time, where one could hear Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Latin, and Hebrew spoken on a single street. It was a world born from violence, but over time learned the intricate art of coexistence. The conquest of Constantinople wasn't fought only on its walls, but also in the minds of people. And Mehmed II was, perhaps, the first ruler in history to grasp that information warfare was as crucial as an artillery duel. From the outset, he deliberately crafted his public image. To his people, he was not merely the Sultan, but Fatih, the Conqueror, the fulfiller of an ancient prophecy from the Hadith that promised immense glory to whoever captured the city. This status almost deified him, transforming the military campaign into a sacred jihad and rendering any doubt in its success an act of heresy. But for the conquered and for the wider world, he engineered another, even more potent myth. By adopting the title Kaiser-i-Rom, Caesar of Rome, he executed a brilliant propaganda coup. This was a signal to the Greeks: your empire hasn't died, it has simply changed dynasties. I am your new, legitimate emperor. It was a challenge to Europe. The true Rome is now here, in Istanbul, not in Germany. All his subsequent actions aimed to reinforce this myth. He didn't just rebuild the city, he transformed it into an international hub, inviting not only Muslims but also Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. He commissioned his portrait from the Italian artist Gentile Bellini, portraying himself as an enlightened Renaissance monarch rather than a barbarian. Naturally, in Europe, the counter-propaganda machine immediately whirred to life. If for the Ottomans, Mehmed was Fatih, For the Christian world, he became the Antichrist, the Great Turk, a spawn of hell. The printing press, a recent invention, disseminated pamphlets to every European court, detailing monstrous atrocities supposedly committed in the captured city. The real horrors of the three-day plunder were exaggerated to apocalyptic proportions. Tales of rivers of blood, desecrated altars, and infants impaled on spears circulated widely. These tales, this 15th century smear campaign, had a singular objective: to demonize the enemy and rouse European monarchs into launching a new crusade, which, for all the fervor, never materialized. The myth of a bloodthirsty, cruel, and depraved Eastern despot, a destroyer of Christendom, took root deep within the European psyche, and this image proved remarkably persistent. Even today, for many in the West, the fall of Constantinople is not a complex historical event, but a simple, terrifying fable about how savage hordes snuffed out the beacon of civilization. This brings us to a classic case of history being written by the victors. Consider one specific episode: Mehmed's entry into the city. According to official Ottoman historiography, it was a tableau of magnanimity and mercy. The Sultan, allegedly grieved by the destruction, immediately halted the plunder, entered Hagia Sophia, dismounted his horse, and, as a sign of humility before Allah, sprinkled dust from the marble floor onto his turban. He then granted the inhabitants their lives and freedom of worship. This paints the picture of a wise and benevolent ruler who brings order, not chaos. However, if we turn to the diaries of eyewitnesses, such as Niccolo Barbaro, or simply to the logic of events, a vastly different picture emerges. The promise of 3 days of pillaging was not only real, but absolutely essential to motivate a battle-weary army. Stopping this frenzied multitude overnight was an impossible feat. Most likely, Mehmed genuinely was struck by the sheer scale of the devastation, yet not out of humanitarian concern, but rather pragmatism. He had conquered a capital reduced to ruins. His subsequent decrees to protect the populace were less an act of mercy and more a desperate gambit to rescue his grand prize from utter annihilation by his own soldiers. The official narrative, penned by court chroniclers, was a brilliant retouching, an elegant veil that hid the bloody, chaotic truth behind a facade of imperial grandeur and piety. After the initial shock and the plundering subsided, a brief, deceptive dawn broke. It seemed Mehmed's grand vision of a synthesis of civilizations was on the cusp of realization. He declared himself the protector of the Orthodox Church, appointed a new patriarch, Gennadius Scholarius, and began to enlist the Greek populace in the city's reconstruction. A pivotal figure in this fragile new order was the Grand Duke Loukas Notaras, the highest-ranking Byzantine aristocrat who had survived the siege and sworn fealty to the new ruler. In him, many saw a bridge between the old world and the new, a symbol that the Greek elite could indeed find its place within the Ottoman Empire. This was the last hope that conquest might transform into convergence. But it was precisely here, amidst the hushed whispers of palace intrigue, that a fatal choice was forged. The initial ambition to become the legitimate successor to Rome collided with the cold, hard logic of maintaining power. The very means that had secured victory, ruthlessness, suspicion, absolute centralization, began to devour the objective itself. The military top brass, the Janissary Agas and Pashas, saw Notaras not as a future ally, but as an enemy who had merely been scotched, not killed. In their eyes, he was a snake, merely biding his time to strike. They whispered to the Sultan, "How can you trust a man who, just yesterday, was our enemy's right hand? Mercy is weakness. To rule them, you must break their spirit, and to do that, you must sever their heads." An invisible schism rent Mehmed's court from within. On one side stood the intellectuals and mystics, inspired by the vision of a multicultural empire, who urged the Sultan to show magnanimity and leverage the administrative expertise of the Greek aristocracy to build a new Rome. They clung to the original grand idea. On the other were the pragmatists of war, for whom only one reality existed: conqueror and conquered. They demanded not integration, but total control, not dialogue, but subjugation. And Mehmed, his character already forged in the crucible of siege, made his choice. He chose not the dream, but security, not the grand idea, but absolute power. The turning point arrived with a tale that transformed political calculation into personal tragedy. According to some chronicles, Mehmed, captivated by the beauty of Notaras' younger son, demanded he be given over to the palace as a page, an act that essentially meant consigning him to the Sultan's harem. For a Byzantine aristocrat, raised with the Roman ideals of honor and Christian morality, this demand was a monstrous affront, worse than death itself. Notaras refused. This refusal became the final straw for Mehmed. He perceived it not as a father's defense of honor, but as an act of open defiance, a direct challenge to his absolute power over the lives and bodies of his subjects. Then came a symbolic act that marked the end of all hope. On June 5, 1453, just 1 week after the city's fall, Loukas Notaras and his 2 sons were arrested and publicly beheaded. This was not merely the execution of a potential conspirator, it was a political manifesto delivered with chilling clarity. With this act, Mehmed II burned the very bridge he himself had attempted to build. He proclaimed to the entire Greek elite and to the world, there would be no merger. There would be a master and there would be subjects. The old aristocracy would not be integrated. It would be eradicated. This decision irrevocably twisted the original vision. Instead of becoming Kaiser Rum in the eyes of the Romans themselves, Mehmed became for them only Fatih, the conqueror, a foreign tyrant. The goal, the revival of the Roman Empire in a new guise, was sacrificed to the means, total control and the annihilation of any potential resistance. The dream of a grand synthesis perished on the executioner's block alongside Byzantium's last Grand Duke. From this moment on, the Ottoman Empire embarked on a different path, not one of integration, but of domination. And this second point of no return proved even more crucial than the siege of the walls itself, shaping the complex and tragic relationship between Turks and Greeks for centuries to come. The execution of Loukas Notaras was not just an act of vengeance, but the symbolic demolition of the entire old social edifice. Upon its ruins, Mehmed II, with lightning speed, began to erect an entirely new pyramid of power. At its apex, of course, was he himself, the absolute monarch whose will was law. But who filled the void left by the annihilated Byzantine aristocracy? The victors. Istanbul's new elite was forged in the fires of war and comprised 2 distinct castes. The first, the askeri, were the military nobility, pashas, beys, and janissary commanders, whose status now depended not on ancient lineage, but on personal loyalty to the Sultan and battle prowess. The second, the ilmiya, were the men of knowledge, the ulama, judges and theologians who provided ideological legitimacy for the new power. For Greeks, Armenians, and other non-Muslims, there was no place in this new structure. They transformed from masters of the city into its perpetual tenants, tolerated yet disempowered. The world turned a page written in blood and fire. A 1,000-year-old elite, proud of its kinship with Roman Caesars, vanished in a single week, yielding to a new Turkic aristocracy of the sword and the Quran. But a city stripped of its elite and half depopulated after the siege was not a capital. It was a stone sarcophagus. And Mehmed immediately launched one of history's most ambitious forced resettlement programs, the Surgun. This was an economy built quite literally on the bones of the old world. By his command, thousands of families were forcibly moved to Istanbul from all corners of the vast empire, from Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Greek islands. Who were they bringing? Not peasants, but the most valuable human capital, skilled artisans, wealthy merchants, scholars. Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, ethnic and religious affiliation didn't matter. The key factor was economic potential. Mehmed, like a ruthless but brilliant gardener, uprooted the finest plants from his imperial garden and transplanted them onto the scorched soil of the new capital, determined to make it blossom once more. Where did the immense resources, plundered from the city and extracted from new territories, go? They were immediately funneled into the most ambitious construction project of the era. Istanbul wasn't just to be reborn. It was to transform its very identity, becoming a dazzling showcase of Ottoman might. Where ancient Byzantine markets once stood, the monumental Grand Bazaar rose, quickly becoming the throbbing heart of all Mediterranean trade. Upon the ruins of the ancient Acropolis, construction began on Topkapi Palace, destined to serve as the world's political epicenter for centuries. Dozens of churches were converted into mosques, and alongside them, new, even more magnificent Islamic complexes sprouted up, complete with madrasas, hospitals, and caravanserais. This was no mere restoration, it was a complete reboot of the urban landscape. Trade routes didn't vanish, they were rerouted. Now, all the financial and mercantile currents that once flowed through Constantinople to Europe converged in Istanbul, enriching the Sultan's coffers and transforming the city into the undisputed economic hub of 3 continents. For the Ottomans, the city's fall ignited a moment of absolute, intoxicating euphoria. It wasn't merely a military triumph, it was a divine affirmation of their historical mission. The dream of the Red Apple, cherished for centuries, had finally come to pass. This sparked an incredible sense of self-belief among the people and the army, a near messianic conviction that nothing was beyond their grasp. This collective euphoria became the psychological fuel that powered Ottoman conquests for the next 200 years, right up to the gates of Vienna. The Ottoman worldview shifted irrevocably. They were no longer just one of many regional powers. They saw themselves as global hegemons, the rightful heirs to Rome and the new masters of history. For the surviving Greeks, the experience was diametrically opposite. Not euphoria, but a profound collective trauma, a civilizational shock from which they have yet to fully recover. For them, May 29th, 1453, marked the end of a world that didn't quite end. The world didn't perish, but their world, the world of the Romans, the Second Rome, the 1,000-year axis of the Orthodox universe, vanished. This forged a unique psychology of survival. Stripped of their state, their army, and political power, they retreated into a staunch defense, finding their last bastion in what could not be conquered: their Orthodox faith, the Greek language, and a shared historical memory of a glorious past and a colossal catastrophe. Their worldview contracted from imperial to communal. The primary task became not governing the world, but preserving themselves, their identity, within a foreign and hostile sea. Thus, the city's fall was not only its end, but also the tragic birth of the modern Greek nation, bound together by a shared wound. To grasp the true magnitude of the events of 1453, one must descend to the deepest level, the realm of ideas. Beneath the roar of cannons and the clash of swords, an unheard yet decisive battle was waged, a clash of philosophical doctrines. The idea that truly governed Mehmed II's mind was far more intricate than a mere hunger for power. It was the concept of Translatio Imperii, the transfer of empire. According to this ancient, almost mystical principle, global dominion, once established by Rome, cannot simply vanish. It is akin to a sacred flame passed from one great power to another. Mehmed was utterly convinced that a decaying Byzantium, the Second Rome, had exhausted its historical mandate. And now it was his turn. His Ottoman state was predestined to receive this baton, to become the third and final Rome, uniting East and West under its dominion. He saw himself not as a barbaric destroyer, but as a legitimate heir, restoring a global empire on a new, more enduring foundation. The intellectual engine behind this grand project was Mehmed himself. Yet, like a masterful conductor, he orchestrated two vastly different ensembles. The first comprised the Islamic theologians, the ulema, who served as his grey eminences in matters of faith. It was they who unearthed and expertly packaged prophecies from the hadith for the masses, imbuing the entire campaign with sacred status. They provided ideological mobilization, transforming soldiers into warriors of faith and conquest, into the fulfillment of divine will. This religious fatalism, this absolute conviction in their divine destiny, endowed the Ottoman army with an unbreakable psychological armor. But concurrently, Mehmed drew upon an entirely different, seemingly incompatible wellspring: Italian humanists and the legacy of antiquity. His court teemed with European engineers, artists, and scholars. He devoured biographies of Alexander the Great and meticulously studied the treatises of Roman strategists. This second ensemble provided him not with faith, but with the technology of power. From Islamic sages, he gleaned the concept of divine right. From ancient and Renaissance thinkers, he acquired the practical knowledge of how to realize that right through logistics, engineering, and sheer political will. In Mehmed's mind, Islamic fatalism paradoxically merged with the Renaissance cult of the active, history-making individual. Opposing this dynamic, syncretic philosophy was an entirely different doctrine, the very philosophical bedrock of Byzantium itself. By the 15th century, the Byzantine worldview had become profoundly eschatological, that is, oriented towards the end of days. In their cosmic vision, Constantinople was more than just a capital. It was the catacon, the final bulwark holding the world back from the advent of the Antichrist and the ultimate apocalypse. Their philosophy was not proactive, but reactive. It was a doctrine of preservation, not progress, of siege, not expansion. They believed their task was not to make history, but to stoically endure it until the very end, relying not on technology, but on the intercession of the Theotokos, to whom the city was consecrated. On the shores of the Bosphorus, two utterly incompatible visions of the world crashed into each other. On one side stood a philosophy of historical optimism and proactive engagement, deeply convinced that humanity, embodied by the Sultan, served as God's chosen instrument to forge a new global order. On the other, a philosophy steeped in historical pessimism and passive anticipation, asserting that humankind's sole duty was to safeguard the last vestiges of a sacred order in a world hurtling inexorably toward its demise. It was a titanic clash, the will to power pitted against the will to survive. Thus, the fall of Constantinople transcended a mere military defeat. It represented a profound philosophical bankruptcy. Mehmed's formidable cannons didn't merely shatter the stone of the Theodosian walls. They utterly annihilated a millennia-old doctrine proclaiming the city's divine election and impregnable nature. The Ottoman triumph delivered the most vivid and resounding proof that history marches onward, propelled not by passive anticipation of a miracle, but by an active, ruthless, and intellectually astute will to fundamentally reshape the world. Grand systems, forged by the singular will of a genius, seldom outlast their creator. Such was the fate of Mehmed's empire. In 1481, when the Conqueror suddenly died amidst preparations for a new campaign, the perfectly calibrated machinery of power didn't merely grind to a halt, it spiraled into chaos. The system immediately began to cannibalize itself. The first to strike were the Janissaries, the elite guard who had long served as the Sultan's iron fist. Weary of incessant warfare and rigid discipline, they revolted directly in Istanbul. Yet, their rebellion wasn't aimed at an external foe. Instead, they rose up against Mehmed's very legacy, against his indomitable energy, his boundless ambition, and his disdain for established traditions. The instrument of conquest, honed to lethal perfection, had morphed into a tool of internal upheaval. Into this brewing chaos, like twin bolts of lightning, two competing wills, two divergent interpretations of a monumental legacy, crashed down. Mehmed's sons, Bayezid and Cem, stepped onto the tumultuous stage. This was far more than a mere struggle for the throne. It was an ideological inferno of civil war, a conflagration that would ultimately determine the very identity of the Ottoman Empire. The elder son, Bayezid, serving as governor in distant Amasya, garnered the support of the old aristocracy and the conservative religious establishment. He embodied order, piety, and consolidation. In his view, his father had already achieved the ultimate feat, the conquest of Rome. Now, the imperative wasn't to expand the empire indefinitely, but to fortify it from within and transform it into a truly Islamic state. He was an heir who sought to preserve and consolidate his inheritance. The younger brother, Cem, was his polar opposite. Governor of prosperous Konya, a poet and an intellectual surrounded by humanists, he was truly his father's son, a Renaissance prince who dreamed of fresh campaigns into Italy and Hungary. He viewed the conquest of Constantinople not as a grand finale, but merely as a stirring prologue to the establishment of a genuine global empire, one that would span from the Atlantic all the way to Persia. He was an heir driven to multiply and transform his legacy. Cem pulled his father's grand vision toward continued expansion and a synthesis with the West. Bayezid, conversely, leaned toward pious isolation and the reinforcement of traditions. The empire fractured into two. Following a brief yet brutal civil war, Cem suffered defeat, but he neither perished nor surrendered. He took an unthinkable, audacious step. Fleeing to the west, he sought aid from his father's adversaries, first among the Egyptian Mamluks, and then from the Knights Hospitaller on the island of Rhodes. In that pivotal moment, he transcended being merely a contender for the throne. He became the last, lingering shard of Mehmed's dream, its haunting, living ghost. And here begins the most tragic chapter of this story. For the European powers, for the Hospitallers, for the Pope, for the kings of France and Naples, Prince Cem became the most invaluable political asset. He wasn't a guest, he was a hostage. He was held in gilded captivity, a perpetual threat that could be unleashed on his brother Bayezid at any moment. For 13 years, this potential heir to the new Rome was shuffled from castle to castle across old Europe. He was a living symbol of an unfulfilled history, the last bearer of that very idea of East-West synthesis his father had envisioned. His end was both predictable and sorrowful. In 1495, in Naples, amidst yet another political intrigue, Cem died. Nearly all historians concur that he was poisoned by agents sent by his brother Bayezid, who had for years paid immense sums to Europeans for the upkeep of his greatest nightmare. With Cem's death, more than just a dynastic threat expired. The very possibility of a different path for the Ottoman Empire vanished. The era of the Conqueror, with his global ambitions, intellectual daring, and openness to the world, definitively concluded. Bayezid triumphed, and with him, the system that had grown weary of genius also prevailed. The empire chose predictable stability over a bold leap into the unknown. Mehmed's grand project wasn't destroyed by an external enemy. It was quietly dismantled from within by his own heirs, who preferred the grandeur of the past to the risky grandeur of the future. After the final battles for Mehmed's legacy had faded, the complex, multi-layered history of Constantinople's fall was for centuries cast in the bronze of two simple, powerful myths. For Europe, the event transformed into a Gothic horror story, a symbol of barbarism's ultimate triumph over civilization. Mehmed, the Renaissance intellectual, morphed into a caricature of an Eastern tyrant, and the city's fall itself became an eternal reproach to a fractured Christendom. Conversely, within the Ottoman Empire, the event of 1453 became a sacred act of foundation, a pivotal point for imperial greatness. Mehmed became Fatih, the holy warrior, and the conquest, a divine mandate to govern the world. In both cases, an incredibly intricate engineering, economic, and psychological drama was flattened into a mere poster. Truth drowned in propaganda. Centuries of oblivion finally ended in the 19th and truly in the 20th century when a new breed of historians emerged, not chroniclers, but detectives. Armed with methods of critical analysis, they returned to primary sources. The diary of the Venetian Niccolo Barbaro, read for centuries as a tragic poem, transformed in their hands into the technical report of a test engineer. They began comparing his notes on shot counts, reload times, and damage characteristics with archaeological data and modern ballistics. This was a genuine rediscovery. Historians, like restorers, began to peel away layer after layer of the myth's centuries-old gilding, revealing an entirely different picture beneath. Not a divine miracle or a devilish delusion, but a complex mechanism comprising hundreds of cogs, economics, logistics, psychology, and fateful chance. It was then that it became clear the key to Mehmed's victory wasn't the cannon, but a systemic approach. They saw not just a conqueror, but a brilliant project manager who staked everything on one high-risk technological startup. This new interpretation shifted the focus from "who is to blame" to "how did this work?" And that changed everything. The story of Constantinople's fall ceased being a moral parable and became one of the greatest case studies in the history of management and military innovation. But as is often the case, this rediscovery spawned a new wave of misinterpretations. During the nationalist fervor of the 19th and 20th centuries, the old story became fuel for new political projects. For the burgeoning Greek nation, the fall of Constantinople emerged as a central trauma, an unhealing wound in the national psyche, a day of perpetual mourning. I alosi, the fall, a phrase still uttered in Greece with a particular catch in the throat. This great catastrophe became the bedrock for the great idea, a dream of revanche and the rebirth of Byzantium with Constantinople as its capital. Concurrently, in 20th century Turkey, especially in recent decades, the opposite process has unfolded. The conquest of 1453 transformed from a historical event into the main blockbuster in the cinema of national pride. Grand reenactments of the assault, lavish anniversary celebrations, all are deployed to bolster Turkey's image as a great power, heir to a glorious imperial past. Thus, the very same event, reinterpreted, became for some a symbol of eternal sorrow and dashed hopes, while for others, a symbol of triumph and unyielding power. The complex history of the 15th century was once again reduced to simple, convenient slogans for the 21st. And so, having journeyed all this way from Urban's foundry pits to the plundered libraries of Constantinople, we complete the circle. We began with a simple question. How did the world's most perfect fortress fall to a single new technology? Now we see that the true walls that crumbled that day were not made of stone and mortar. They were walls of imagination, walls of a familiar worldview, walls of faith that the past guaranteed the future. Urban's cannon was merely the master key that unlocked a long-rotted lock. And here we confront the central, irresolvable paradox of this entire history. The superweapon, commonly believed to have decided the battle's outcome, actually suffered a technical defeat. The Basilica was temperamental, fragile. It broke down and failed to deliver the decisive fatal blow. The city fell due to a random wound and a forgotten postern gate. Yet its psychological spectre, its deafening reputation, its myth, won the war even before the final assault. The cannon didn't break a wall, but the belief system that made that wall impregnable. It turns out that the most material creation of the era, a colossal piece of bronze, achieved its greatest victory in an entirely immaterial realm, in the human mind. So, what truly changes the world? Technology itself, or the fear and hope it ignites in our minds? Today, we stand on the shoulders of these giants and these ghosts. We, like the Byzantines, have surrounded ourselves with the most sophisticated walls humanity has ever known. Walls of global financial systems, digital networks, and nuclear deterrence. We believe in their complexity, their power, their invulnerability. But the history of 1453 remains an eternal, silent rebuke to our overconfidence. Time and again, it poses the same uncomfortable question. And looking at all this, the ultimate question arises: is history a spiral, where we, on a new technological turn, are doomed to repeat the same mistake, patching up our old walls to the very last, blinded by their former glory, until an unthinkable canon someday emerges to render them all meaningless? Or are we, after all, capable of learning Constantinople's fundamental lesson, that the strongest wall is not stone or code, but the flexibility of our imagination, the ability to recognize in time that the rules of the game have changed forever?